morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my Lord. First this morning, my Lord, we have a panel from Social Work Scotland.
Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
I hope you can manage to fit in that tight desk. Very good when you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning.
Good morning.
Before I begin, just a brief reminder that this morning's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak as slowly and clearly, that will assist the stenographers greatly. I'm going to come to you each, first of all, if you could tell me your full name, what your current position is, if there was any different position during the pandemic, and any other role that you hold out with of Social Work Scotland. If I could come to you first, Mr. Farrugia.
Absolutely. Good morning. I am Ben Farrugia. I'm the Director of Social Work Scotland.
Thank you. And were you Director during the pandemic?
I was.
Thank you. And Ms. Traynor?
Good morning.
Just to say in respect of the mics, you don't need to touch the mics. They are quite sensitive, so they'll pick you up from where they are. Thank you.
Good morning. My full name is John Campbell Traynor. I am Head of Children and Justice Social Work in Renfrewshire Council, the Council's Chief Social Work Officer. I've been a member of Social Work Scotland for about 8 or 9 years. I'm currently the convener of Social Work Scotland.
Thank you. And Mrs. Smith?
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Smith. I am the Head of Service for Justice Social Work in Glasgow at the moment, and currently the Vice Chair of the Social Work Scotland Standing Committee. During the course of the pandemic, I was a service manager in Glasgow and a committee member for part of the pandemic during that time.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you. Glyn Lloyd, Head of Children's and Justice Social Work in Dundee, and Chief Social Work Officer in Dundee as well for the last 12 months. So I wasn't Chief Social Work Officer during the pandemic, and just recently become co-chair as well of the Justice Standing Committee with Social Work Scotland.
Thank you. Social Work Scotland has provided 2 statements to the inquiry. First of all, a general statement, sorry, I said general statement, it's a Rule 8 response, and that, my Lord, is SCI SWS XXX 1025. And secondly, Social Work Scotland has provided a specific response to justice questions, and that is reference SCI SWS XXX 1027. Just to confirm, everything within those responses will be taken into account by the inquiry. We may not have an opportunity to get to everything this morning, but we will try and touch upon as much as we can. If I could start this morning by asking a little about Social Work Scotland, Mr. Farrugia, could I ask you first of all, who or what is Social Work Scotland?
A nice tricky question to start. Social Work Scotland is a professional association. We were established in the late 60s through a discussion between central government and what was local government social work in those days here in Scotland, as a mechanism to facilitate interaction between those two spheres, to support the implementation of the recently passed 1968 Social Work Scotland Act, which established social work in its sort of current form here in Scotland. And we've existed ever since to continue to provide that mechanism. For most of that time, we were the Association of Directors of Social Work, because until the late 90s, a statutory role in every Scottish local authority was a Director of Social Work responsible for the Directorate of Social Work. Since the late 90s, we have had Chief Social Work Officers here, which actually we have 2 of whom with us else on the panel. That is a statutory position, and Social Work Scotland sort of exists now to provide the sort of national support for those local authority social workers in the delivery of their national function. I should stress they don't have an explicit national function, but in the delivery of their local roles, there is obviously a sort of unwritten national component. And of course, the interaction between the 32 local authorities is very important, and we exist in that space. So Glyn and Lindsay here on the panel are chairs of our Justice Standing Committee, and that's a good example of the kind of infrastructure that we provide in Scotland, enabling all the service managers for justice social work to come together at a national level to plan, debate, discuss developments in justice social work.
Thank you. And who are the members of Social Work Scotland?
Our membership is overwhelmingly local government social work senior managers. We do have a diversity of membership. We have social workers who also come from the independent sector, so voluntary and private sectors. We also have colleagues who come from nursing and so forth. So our membership reflects the reality of social work services, which employ more than just social workers, and the delivery of social work services necessarily includes those professionals as well. But overwhelmingly, over 98% of our membership is local government social workers, and as I stress, the senior managers, so chief social work officers is a key group of that, but then heads of service, service managers and so forth.
Thank you. And geographically, what is the coverage of Social Work Scotland?
The complete coverage of the country, so all 32 chief social work officers, for example, but because public service structures are quite complicated now, we also have representation from the NHS, because in Highland, NHS Highland provides adult social work, for example. So full coverage.
Thank you. And you're obviously the director of Social Work Scotland. Are you yourself a social worker?
I am not a social worker. Since 2018, I have been in this role. This role is to oversee the team that exists to support our members in the delivery of their functions, and to advocate and represent them at a national level with government and with Parliament and so forth. So we fulfil that role, linking closely with COSLA and the rest of the local government family of organisations as well.
Thank you. And could you give His Lordship an indication of what the size of that team is?
We have a core team of approximately 10, and then we have another 15 who are employed on specific Scottish Government and local government funded programmes to affect change and improvement in social work. So at the moment, we're a current total headcount of 26.
Thank you. Mr. Traynor, I wonder if you could, before we come on to the specifics of the pandemic, I'd like to talk very briefly about the arrangements for delivery of social work in Scotland more generally. How are social work services delivered in Scotland? What is the mechanism for that?
So social work is a statutory responsibility of local government. However, in terms of adult social work, the delivery model is through integrated joint boards in 31 of the 32 local areas. And as Mr Ferrugia indicated, in Highland there's a particular model where adult social work is delivered by the NHS on behalf of the local authority. The Act which created the integrated joint boards and the local delivery models are known as health and social care partnerships. Those health and social care partnerships must deliver adult social work, so mental health, learning disability, addiction services. In some areas they cover homeless services, they will cover older adults. The Children and Justice Social Work Service was not required to be delegated, so in around half of the local authorities in Scotland, the Children and Justice Social Work remains a part of the local authority and is delivered through the local authority. And that's where the role, perhaps I can explain, the role of the Chief Social Work Officer becomes important. The Chief Social Work Officer is a senior qualified social worker who's got experience in the delivery of services, but also got strategic experience in planning services. And if your social work services are separated, so some delivered in the adult social world through the Health and Social Care Partnership, some delivered through the local authority, the Chief Social Work Officer has an advisory role to the Health and Social Care Partnership. Chief Social Work Officer also has a direct link and route to the Chief Executive of the local authority, to the elected members in the local authority, and the senior management team within the local authority to provide guidance on the complex nature of social work delivery.
Thank you. Does that, and it may be implicit from what you've said, but does that mean that the way that social work functions, and indeed the the body that are providing social work functions can differ in different local authorities?
Yes, absolutely. So whilst there's a national framework for the delivery and legislation covers our core functions, there is freedom within local authorities to prioritise the areas of need. That's based on local profiles, so every local authority will undertake an understanding of demand within their local area. They will look at the population, how it's made up, where the challenges are, what your priorities are. So if we look at the 32 local authorities in Scotland, there are some where there are more areas of affluence. The challenges in those areas will be different from areas where there are significant levels of poverty. And some local authorities have a mix of affluence and poverty. So Renfrewshire is a good example. We have some very affluent areas, and we have some of Scotland's poorest areas. The life expectancy can vary almost 15 years between those two areas. So that throws up particular challenges. So we need to think about how our services address the particular local issues, and the Act gives us that freedom. One of the things that Social Work Scotland tries to do is make sure that we have a sort of base level where we all work to the same principles, where we all work to try and achieve the same outcomes for our population, but we do require some local flexibility in terms of how we do that.
Mr. Trainer's described there, if I could come back to you, Mr. Farrugia, Mr. Trainer's described there the differences across Scotland in terms of the local authorities, and indeed that sort of minimal standard, if I can paraphrase, in terms of the application. What role does Social Work Scotland take in terms of the national outlook and development of that kind of policy?
So we have no statutory role in this space. So again, our legitimacy and authority is derived from our membership, and primarily the Chief Social Work Officer role that is a statutory role and does have specific responsibilities set out in law in relation to their responsibility for the profession. Working under their governance, we actively participate in the development and the support of implementation of national policy. I mentioned earlier in my previous answer about the representation of their views. That is largely done by Chief Social Work Officers themselves, but facilitated by us. I also mentioned before, in relation to the structure of the team that I'm responsible for, we have agreed, again, with the support and consent of Chief Social Work Officers, to host specific individuals at a national level who assist local government social work with the implementation of policy or the delivery of that policy, where we have identified collectively that there needs to be improvement.
Thank you. Mrs. Smith, we've heard obviously that there's a great deal of integration in terms of the services that social work provide. Could you give His Lordship an indication? I'm sure His Lordship has come across social workers in his previous role, but for the benefit of others,
positively, if I may say so.
but for the benefit of others who may not have, could you give His Lordship an indication of the kinds of areas where social workers work?
Okay, so specific to justice?
In general, if I may,
okay.
But including justice.
Okay. So social work is involved in a number of areas, from justice social work, so delivering statutory justice services to supervise those in the community on criminal justice orders. We have children and families, again another statutory service delivering child protection procedures. And services to support families in the community. We also have social work delivering adult support and protection, mental health services. We have adults and older people supporting people to live at home with care. We also have social work staff delivering services within residential settings, from adults and older people's accommodation to learning disability, to children's houses. So there's a breadth of areas in which, cradle to grave, in which social work are involved in.
This may seem like a slightly strange question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there any limit to social work's, the scope of its role?
So we work within a statutory framework, so there's limits placed on us by the statutory framework in which we work in. So yes, there is limits to how we work. We have diversified over the years. Not all social workers are involved in delivering statutory pieces of work. We recognise that to work with families and to work with older people and in the community in general, it takes a very unique response. So we have social workers in spaces which are not statutory but are looking to prevent admissions into care, to work with families early, to divert them from needing statutory input. So there is a clear framework in which we work in, but we diversify in delivering a whole host of services.
When members of the public have issues that they can't otherwise address, do they find themselves at social work's door?
Not necessarily. We're very clear that social work is here to provide a social work service. We work on principles of maximising independence. We're not looking to become involved in people's life where there's not a legitimate reason for us to be involved. So not all problems would appropriately be managed within social work. People are resilient in themselves, and we would always want to encourage them to seek their own solutions and their own support networks. And there is a plethora of other resources in the community that we would encourage members of the public to access before coming to social work.
Thank you. If I could turn now to the role of Social Work Scotland during the pandemic. Can I ask you, Mr. Farrugia, what was, at a general level, what was Social Work Scotland's role during the pandemic?
Scotland doesn't have national structures for social work. We have the profession, the bit of the profession extends beyond the public sector, as I mentioned earlier, but the bit that obviously is, I think, of particular interest in the case here and in the delivery of public services sits within local government. There is not a layer above local government, as it were, that coordinates those 32. We obviously do have a national government, but the national government itself does not maintain any national structures, and nor does local government, if that sentence makes sense. So in that void, when the pandemic emerged, we were the most well-placed, I might say, and perhaps the most legitimate organisation to provide that core mediating function between national developments, and that's not just out of Scottish Government, that's with our NHS partners and others who were trying to manage the pandemic, and local government social work who were necessarily part of that response and the continued provision of social work services. So I think I used the phrase in the written submission we made as sort of quasi-statutory. I'm not sure if that actually makes any sense, that phrase, but the idea being that on the basis of the legitimacy and statutory role of chief social work officers primarily, we acted on their behalf to provide national infrastructure. I think I also used the phrase in the written submission once for Scotland because, of course, having 32 distinct conversations between national government and the 32 local authorities, which was happening. It necessarily had to happen because they are autonomous organisations, but we tried to provide a degree of efficiency when it came to the social work bit of the conversation. So if we were discussing things like access to PPE or vaccines, we could provide the interlocutor for that. But again, stressing that every local area would make their own decisions about how to do that, and every chief social work officer would have a place at that table to articulate their view. Thank you.
Just to pick up on that, you're providing the interface, but ultimately the decision-making still lies with the local authorities.
Very much so, yeah.
And in terms of guidance and recommendations and policy input that Social Work Scotland was having, were different decisions taken by local authorities in terms of how they implemented?
They were. It picks up on Mr. Trainor's points earlier. There is diversity in the geography, history, constitutional makeup in terms of their services of each local authority, and those all informed the decisions they took. I wouldn't want to overplay that point. I think there's probably more commonality than there was diversity, but necessarily in responding to the pandemic between Angus and Glasgow, there was necessarily a differential approach. I think the role we tried to ensure, it was very important to chief social work officers and service managers, is that the profession was seen as a national one. And what we didn't want to have, we did have, and we tried to manage and minimise it to the greatest extent possible, was a situation where social workers were perceived and treated and had access to things as key workers in one area, for example, and in another they weren't. As I've acknowledged, that did happen, but we tried to minimise that to the greatest extent possible and ensure that when it came to the way Scottish Government was approaching, but also each individual local authority, they were seeing the profession as a coherent whole and ensuring there wasn't discrimination against the profession in some areas that in other parts of the country there wasn't.
Thank you. You've mentioned, and indeed we have chairs of some of the standing committees of Social Work Scotland, including the Justice, most pertinently, the Justice Committee. In terms of who was undertaking the engagement with the Scottish Government, who was taking that? Was that staff, or was that chief social work members, or was that committee chairs? Or was it a variety?
It was a variety. It was all of that. Our job, as we see it then and now, is to support our members to have that interface. They are the people overseeing the delivery of social work services locally, and it's not our place to speak for them unless that's absolutely necessary. So our job was to enable them. However, in reality, they needed to deliver services. So as long as we were informed, the team that I'm responsible for is overwhelmingly social workers who've come from local government, so they have that credibility and legitimacy and connection back into local government. So for instance, in the team, we have a justice social work lead working to the chair of the Justice Standing Committee, or the chairs as it is now, and they would take direction and steer and would be in a position to both sort of manage the work that needs to happen between meetings. So for instance, if we were having an interaction with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, we would absolutely expect the chairs of our standing committees, maybe some other relevant members, to be part of that conversation with colleagues from those other public bodies. But then we have staff who can take forward the action with their staff, and then we come back to, for instance, if we're signing off a protocol together, bringing back our chairs and the relevant senior management from Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service to sort of confirm that together. So, and that's generally the pattern with which we work.
Did the Scottish Government find your engagement helpful, do you know? Did they give any indication?
Yes, they gave an indication that they found it very helpful, and they made increasing use of it very quickly. And I would say they actually acknowledged throughout and appreciated, I think it's important to acknowledge, the challenge that came through Social Work Scotland from operational social work leaders. I think there were a number of officials and ministers who acknowledged publicly that they were getting a different perspective than they might have been hearing without that input. And we of course felt that was very important to articulate that. So, for instance, around the balance of different human rights in the context of managing the pandemic, that was something very early on that social work managers felt very important to be profiling. It was an issue they were managing locally as they were trying to respond to the pandemic, but nationally as plans were being developed and seeing an overwhelming focus on infection control for completely understandable reasons. I think the executive leadership of Social Work Scotland, so our conveners and the rest of the Chief Social Work Officer group, sought out and got time with officials and ministers to really make that case loudly, and with other professional groups as well, which was important. And we saw the impact of that engagement. So yes, I think we were valued, and I hope continue to be.
Conversely, how did Social Work Scotland find engagement with the Scottish Government?
Mixed over issues and mixed over time. I think at the beginning it was an effort to get the social work voice heard, and I think we were understanding about why that was, but that didn't stop us shouting and trying. And this is again about social workers fulfilling their role, both as professionals and, in the case of chief social work officers and others, their statutory role, which includes advocating for the individuals who receive services. I think quite quickly, as officials and ministers started to understand, which they do not always, the absolute criticality, centrality of social work to many public systems, particularly in crisis, particularly when we are having to take it, we're having to think about the balance of risks. Social workers are woven into those processes, and I think officials started to understand, and then we had a greater opportunity to articulate our perspectives in those. I think towards the end of the pandemic, I think when we hoped that we would be able to continue to articulate what social work needed to recover and recuperate coming out of the pandemic, I think as business as usual returned, so did that business as usual sort of pre-2019 perhaps deafness to the issues that social work are facing. So sort of political priorities perhaps squeezing us out of some of those conversations.
Not to put words in your mouth, but you said that they started to understand. Is it implicit from that there was a lack of understanding at the start? It's both implicit and I would say it explicitly, yes, absolutely. Social work is not simple, and I think as your questions have encouraged us to speak to, it exists in many domains. It is not a simple service tied to a particular setting, and that's not to say that our colleagues working in the various health professions or education have simple professions, but social work is unusual, and it is difficult for, I think, many generalist officials to sort of understand, and they tend to interact with it in the narrow confines or silo that they tend to approach policy. So we'll have conversations about mental health and social work without appreciating that those social workers sit in a much bigger system of social work and have a much broader spectrum of interest than, for instance, just the mental health legislation. So I think it is absolutely fair to say, and continues to be, a situation where those who have a degree of responsibility for particularly the legislative infrastructure that social work operates often have a partial understanding about what social work is. We'll come on to discuss the pandemic response in a moment, but before I do that, addressing pre-pandemic matters, again, it may be implicit from what you've just said, but did Social Work Scotland have any engagement with the Scottish Government in terms of planning for a pandemic?
We did not. No.
Excuse me. Mr. Lloyd, I'm going to come on to discuss the specific response to the pandemic in a moment, but I wonder if you had any views more generally about how social work services coped during the pandemic in terms of their staff and in terms of the workloads and the like.
I would say that it was a huge challenge, as with all public sector partners nationally and locally. And I remember the first day of the pandemic when we had lockdown and we had to ask, is social work an essential service? First of all, and obviously the answer was yes. And then the question was, well then, how do we deliver that service whilst complying with public health requirements in a way that mitigates risk to teams, in a way that mitigates risk to service users, whilst also at the same time, as far as possible, enables us to continue to meet those statutory requirements we've referred to, and in fact addresses broader public protection concerns, because obviously, even though there's a risk of infection from COVID-19, there were other risks in relation, for instance, to child protection, adult support and protection, offending and re-offending amongst people that were subject to commuted sentences and prison licence conditions. So those were the initial questions we had to ask and find answers that helped us to navigate through all of that. And sometimes that involved us having to arrive at conclusions which involved the least worst option, which are very often risk-based. So, for instance, somebody presented as a high risk of harm to others or to themselves or from others would need to be prioritised in terms of the nature and level of support. Somebody who didn't quite perhaps fall into those more acute categories of risk wouldn't need to be prioritised, but they would need to receive some form of support, which would often be in the form, for instance, of telephone conversations, or over the course of the pandemic, video conversations as IT access improved. But incredibly challenging, and obviously, as the pandemic unfolded, and when we received different guidance and there were different levels and stages of the pandemic, we had to continually adapt. And some confusion, I think it would be fair to say, during that process, and hugely dependent in many ways on ongoing dialogue with national organisations such as Social Work Scotland and through Social Work Scotland with Scottish Government.
Again, just in its generality, taking all that into account, do you feel social work services were delivered successfully during the pandemic in the circumstances?
I think from a local perspective, I can say with some confidence that they were, and I can say that certainly in relation to children's services, because we were inspected during the pandemic. But it wasn't easy. You know, it was a huge stretch. I think it's fair to say.
Thank you. Mr. Traynor, Mr. Farrugia's discussed the lack of understanding, if I can put it that way, that was met at the start of the pandemic from Scottish Government. He's also touched upon the thread, if I can put it that way, of human rights concerns that was running through the interactions that were being had with the Scottish Government. At the start of the pandemic, we all know we immediately faced lockdown and other measures. Do you feel that enough thought or emphasis was put on the human rights or the other impacts that were occurring in social work circumstances in comparison with that, if I can put it this way, infection control, the immediate infection control?
So I think, thinking back to March 2020, the immediate priority obviously was about trying to prevent the spread of a virus which we thought would be incredibly damaging to our whole society. So we went into lockdown, and infection control became, I think, the primary concern for Scotland. We had to think about the rights of those people who are most distant from other services. And that we had to say there are rights that people have in relation to the ability to maintain family relations, for example. So if I give an example, children who were looked after and accommodated by the local authority in foster care or residential children's houses, residential schools, found themselves not able to visit their family. So we had to be nimble and remind government that these children, young people and their families had a right of access to that family time, and we had to find solutions to that. Technology helped. But in terms of adults, in particular adults who were involved with the justice world, they are not straightforward, simple people who are only involved with justice. They often have other conditions. It can be mental health conditions, it can be addiction issues, it can be learning disabilities. So you had to think about their rights and their needs to be protected. And then we had to think about how we protected the public from some of the harm that Mr. Lloyd mentioned. So we knew, or we suspected, that if you go into lockdown, that family pressures would continue to be of a higher level, perhaps, than they were out of lockdown. So was domestic violence going to increase as you contain people in their houses? We then had to look at the adult world, where particularly adults in residential care, in residential older people's homes, the infection control said we should remove all personal items from their bedrooms, we should remove all soft furnishing. And we were trying to say, but it's not a hospital, and there are risks around taking those rights away. We had to think about the rights of family to visit relatives who perhaps had dementia. How could you facilitate that in a safe way? And those rights were not thought about, I think, comprehensively, because we only concentrated from government initially on the issue of control of infection. So we had to say we need to find solutions, and that included, for example, in our older adult homes, we built rooms where people could see and be protected. They could visit their loved ones. Not perfect, but at least it allowed that connection to continue. And I think that even in normal times, social work often has to remind authorities of individuals' human rights. So we plan our services, I think, often for the mainstream of society, and those people who are at the edge, we have to sometimes fight to make sure that their needs are seen and identified and responded to and not deprioritised. So I often find myself in meetings with senior colleagues to say that might work for the vast majority of our public, but what about those who are most disadvantaged? And I'll just give you one example of that. We talk about turning down street lighting to save money, and I'll say, how does that increase risk, particularly to women who are walking through, for example, parks or streets where the lights are dimmed? Does that increase a risk of attack? And colleagues look at you as if, I haven't thought about that. We're only thinking about the money. The same thing happened for government in terms of infection control versus rights.
Do you feel there was a lack, therefore, of that sort of holistic view, that holistic understanding in government when they were making these decisions?
I think there was, and Mr Farrugia mentioned that social work doesn't exist as a single service with a single focus. The individuals who are engaged with social work can in fact be individuals who, as I said, have a court order that mandates them because they've been involved in conflict with the law. They might also have an issue around use of drugs or alcohol. They might have might have a mental health issue. They might also be a parent of a child on the Child Protection Register. And government, whether we like it or not, still works often in silos. And the silo of protection from a virus was the silo that had the predominant ear at that particular time. And I wouldn't say that was wrong. I would just say that they needed to be more open. And what we did through Social Work Scotland, and Social Work Scotland did have an important role here, because to try and have the government speak to 32 local authorities actually would have been detrimental to the plans and the preparation and response. So Social Work Scotland found a way to help with that. But we had to constantly remind government that society is not one single place, and by deciding in lockdown there were other risks associated with that, and that we had to think about those responses as well.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think the balance between those rights and other interests and the infection control was right?
Well,
there's no wrong answer. I should say at this point.
I think we did a reasonable job in the balance. I think that the national government and the senior leaders in local authorities actually did, and our health boards actually got the balance right. But they required the support and challenge to make sure that was right. They required a counterbalance and a counter-argument and a discussion that was wider than their initial thoughts. And, through the social work world, I think we showed that. And we talked about how do you deliver services during a pandemic. We locked down the country. We didn't have every social worker with a laptop and internet access and a mobile phone. So we had to think, how do you do that? How do you equip people to respond? But primarily we had a public health threat, and therefore infection control was correct, and I think it was proportionate. But we had to, as a profession, fight to make sure that as quickly as possible we actually released the restrictions, and that included opening offices to allow staff to come back to work. It included challenging some of the safe distance rules that were in place. That was risk assessed, but the strict 2 metres, was that necessary in a social work environment? So we reintroduced some family visiting time, and you were saying to children, you can't go closer than 2 metres to your mum that you've not seen for 6 or 8 weeks. What a ridiculous situation. So we had to be much more approaching risk in a slightly different manner and be less risk averse, I think, than the country was.
In fairness, your giving that answer quite properly from the perspective of social worker, a social worker organisation, and you were talking about the social work and the government's priority in infection control. But there are other interests as well, which, you're not expected to address those, be sure, but you recognise there are other interests that have to be considered by government as well.
Absolutely, and that's why I said in terms of the balance, I think the government probably did get it right, but I think that they still required it. And it was, for example, in education, we had to think about how do you continue to ensure that children remain engaged with education during a period of shutdown. Again, not everyone having access to technology, when one of the solutions was a virtual school. So they had to balance a whole host of different challenges, as they do every single day. But when we've got free movement, it's much easier to manage society. But when you lock down, it becomes much more difficult. We had to think about the protection of workforces across health, in particular, in residential children's houses and older adults. We had to think about the risks to the residents, the risks to the staff. And many staff actually sheltered themselves from their family, so they would finish shift and go home and live in a bedroom separate from the rest of their family to protect those people that they worked with every single day. So that's why I think on balance it was right. But government also needed in some sense a conscience that did challenge back in rights. Remember, other people have rights. But it's not just rights, it's about needs. We couldn't expect everyone to fully understand the requirement for lockdown. If you had a learning disability, your ability perhaps to understand why you couldn't freely leave the house is something you need to plan differently for, and not have them treated as a deviant within society for going out for more than the 1 hour walk, or not understanding that they couldn't visit. So you had to manage all of that, and I think that social work helped the Scottish Government, it helped the decision makers in health, and it helped the decision makers in local government, Police Scotland, to manage a very complex situation.
You've mentioned there, Mr. Trainer.
Mr. Ferrugia wanted to say something actually.
Thank you, my Lordship. I suppose it was just to capture, I hope, in a sentence, I suppose just listening to Mr. Trainer, I think, and just sitting here reflecting back on that period, I think, you know, our task, our challenge, our responsibility was to understand that the government had a responsibility, governments at all levels, to respond to a population level issue, a national population level issue, and its response was obviously framed in that sense. Social work is, at its core, an individualised service. Each individual's needs and the manifestation of their rights is highly individualised, and I suppose that's the space we were trying to navigate in a response that wasn't taking account of individual circumstances, very understandably so, but social work continuing to need to see the person. And I think that, and again, I think I agree with Mr. Trainer. I think from where I was sitting, I think, you know, on the whole, the balance was got right through the exceptional commitment and dedication of individual professionals, putting themselves and their wider families in a position of risk. But I think we did.
Picking up that point of individualisation, and back to you, Mr. Trainer, picking up that observation regarding some of the anomalies, if I can put it that way, in terms of the rules. You mentioned the child not having seen its mother or father for 6 weeks. Anecdotally, in order to address these human rights needs, did social workers find themselves having to flex rules?
I don't think they flexed rules. I think what we did was we gave support to workers to find different ways of doing things. But we were also saying to staff, you're not there to police the pandemic in the same way, in terms of making sure that people did stay those distances. So what we were saying is be human in those relations. We had staff who, you know, conducted social work business through living room windows rather than in people's living rooms as it would normally have been. So you would do your visit, you would undertake your work in someone's house. You were suddenly doing that from the garden. You had to think about their right of privacy, but you had to think about the protection there as well. So once we managed to get staff back, you had to think about what we were doing in relation to how infection control was managed in some of our settings. So you had to think about, if a child comes to a visit to see their parent, the routine of washing their hands we had established as a good routine. But then you were not saying to the child, don't hug your mum, because that would have been impossible to manage, and it would have caused distress. So you encourage staff to be flexible, but also to make sure that the staff themselves actually stayed the distance that they're required to stay. So you allowed the family to connect, and the staff member respected the social distancing, unless there was something that was a risk that they had to intervene.
Thank you. We're here primarily in this set of hearings to talk about justice, and there are some specific justice matters which I know a number of you have been specifically involved with, and we'll come on to those in a moment. But before we get there, I wonder if I can just touch upon a couple of more general restrictions that potentially affected social work. Mrs. Smith, one of the things that's mentioned in the Rule 8 response was the prevention of face-to-face contact, or in-home contact in particular, at the start of the pandemic. I wonder if you could explain to His Lordship what the impact of that might be in terms of the delivery of social work.
So it posed a challenge, the face-to-face contact not being allowed as part of the restrictions. But again, as John has highlighted, we worked with that situation in a creative way. So we were very clear that we needed to continue to manage those who posed a risk of serious harm, and those who were vulnerable, who were currently involved in the justice system. So we were, again, back to day one, back to the first couple of weeks of the restricted measures, we had social work staff visiting people who were subject to MAPA arrangements at their home, not crossing the threshold, but having a conversation with them, over the door. We also put provision in really quickly to ensure that there was mobile phones, although it wasn't always straightforward across the 32 local authorities, but measures were put in place to allow communication channels to be opened with individuals who didn't have access to telephones. So we worked creatively. We were very clear that as a service, and again back to the point that was made earlier on, we were very much viewed ourselves as a key service immediately. So the rules that were in place, we worked flexibly with them in order for us to discharge our duties in protecting the public and engaging with those who were vulnerable. We have services within justice such as drug treatment and testing orders, which require a degree of treatment. So measures that were required to deliver treatment and see people and test them, they remained still in place. As we started to introduce PPE and other measures to protect staff.
Thank you. You used a phrase there, just first of all, MAPA. Could you just confirm what that is?
Sorry, it's multi-agency public protection arrangements.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Not at all. In terms of the inability to access people's homes and indeed levels of interaction, did that have any impact on the numbers of referrals that were being made to social work?
So again, specific to justice or generally?
Generally at this point, if I may.
So I think the experience across the board was that we saw a downturn in referrals. We didn't have, one of our big referrals is education. Education schools were closed, so therefore we didn't have that pathway of referrals from one of our key referrers. Police Scotland, again, is another key referrer into social work services, but given the fact that we saw people advised to remain at home. We were not seeing the same issues within the community that we had seen previously, which would result in social work referrals. So, for instance, concerns around about an adult who may be at risk, or children are offending in the community. We saw a significant downturn in that activity as a direct result of lockdown measures.
Was there any concern that there may be harms that were being hidden in consequence of that?
Yes, so that was a concern almost immediately. It was a concern, I think Mr Traynor mentioned domestic abuse. So within a justice context, we were very clear who was on statutory orders to us, who had offences of domestic abuse, who were still living at home with partners and children. So we were acutely aware of the risks could be escalating in that really tense environment where people were advised to remain in their house for the full day. Not just domestic abuse, but other concerns around about violence. We were recognising as a profession the pressurised situation that families would be living with under one roof, not having that outlet of people coming and going in that flow of people being at work, being at school, or just generally being able to access the community. So, yes.
Was there any evidence of that when we moved out of lockdown? You've talked about the referrals in particular from education sources having dropped. Was there any commensurate increase once we came back out, for example?
So I don't feel in a position to answer that equivalently across the country, and I think it probably would be something that would be interesting to look at in more detail. I think anecdotally, yes, we have spoken to, I'm thinking in particular, we have a women's justice service in Glasgow, and we have heard stories of the pressure that some women dealt with during the course of the pandemic, being in a pressurised home environment or having to leave and becoming homeless during periods of high restrictions. So yes, I think we have dealt with, we have seen the impact of it, and we probably are still seeing the impact of it.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I was reflecting as Mrs Smith was speaking there about actually how our population responded to the pandemic as well. Actually, I think remarkably well. Most people accepted the restrictions, and most people actually decided to cooperate with the restrictions to stay at home, for example. And that did mean that I think we've seen less offending in the community that we might have previously seen. So in the justice world, that certainly is not something that's come forward in terms of lots of offending during the pandemic. But what we do have is we have the tail of those outstanding issues pre-pandemic that have taken much longer to get through the court systems. We then had things like the decisions that we made around unpaid work, for example, where we said that we couldn't deliver unpaid work. The majority of unpaid work in Scotland is delivered through group activity, and that's group activity for the benefit of the community. But you couldn't have that with the social distancing regulations that were in place. That then has an impact in terms of playing catch-up, and there was controversy, obviously, when the government passed regulations that allowed some unpaid hours to be discounted, but they extended the period for completion around the prison early release schemes. And this is where we as a profession stepped in to say there are some people where we thought the risks were too high to release because it was governors' decisions, but we were saying domestic violence, people convicted of violence offences in an intimate relationships, there was a real danger there. We were cautious about agreeing to those recommendations for release. Similarly around those people who were convicted of sexual offences and some violence, so we wanted a voice in there. I think we did see, and I'd said at the beginning, I thought there would have been many more referrals in relation to domestic violence. We didn't see that increase we actually seen a decrease, then a levelling off, and we have seen an increase as we have opened back our full services.
Thank you. Mr. Lloyd, I'm going to move now on to more sort of justice-specific questions, if I may. Again, just more in sort of general terms, could you give His Lordship and everyone watching an indication of the kinds of environments? We'll come on to the specific programmes, etc. in a moment, but in general terms, the sort of kinds of environments that social work is involved in the justice system?
Yes, so we deliver a range of services right across the justice system, from arrest through to sentence and onwards, after and during prison sentences as well. So diversion from prosecution, commission services to support people in police cells, bail supervision, structured deferred sentences, community payback orders, and support to short and long-term prisoners. So there's a range of services from arrest right through to release from prison, with a range of different types of offences and a range of different types of profiles in terms of people's risks and needs and vulnerabilities.
Thank you. And in terms of that work, does that involve, for want of a word, assessing people as part of that role?
So a key part of the role within justice and across social work services, in fact, is risk assessment. Risk of what, to who, when, where, in what circumstances, at what level, how can that be mitigated, what's the plan in relation to that? Do we need to have a contingency plan? Do we need to scenario plan? And how do we apply that plan with and for the person that we're trying to support? And also with partner services as well, on whom we're often dependent: police, prisons, health, third sector, etc.
Were those assessments impacted by the pandemic?
Yes, in the sense that sometimes teams didn't know what they didn't know, given that the justice system was affected and there were fewer referrals into court and fewer court reports and fewer orders. So it was certainly affected in that sense. Yes, as well, in the sense that even with people where there was an initial assessment which might have indicated they were low or medium risk, we're always conscious that risk can change and fluctuate. And if arrangements are in place that only involve telephone contact or video calls, then it's very, very difficult to identify those fluctuations, which might dictate a different type of response. Less so in relation to people where there was an assessment of high risk, because typically they would be seen more often and on a face-to-face basis, where we could respond to any changes with more agility, shall we say.
Where there was that high risk, was that face-to-face engagement maintained throughout the pandemic?
Well, I can't speak on a national basis, but I'm aware of examples elsewhere where that was the case, and certainly locally that was the case as well.
I think, though, that possibly we should say there were some restrictions in how that face-to-face contact would be carried out. So pre-pandemic and currently, you would have access to someone's house, so you're looking at their whole environment, you're actually seeing what the house looks like, you're able to assess, are there risks, dangers there, who else is present, are they exerting control in a particular way. So during the pandemic, particularly the early phase and that period where we were restricted from accessing houses, you were doing that assessment at distance, often, as I said, through a window, a conversation. You were doing it through video calls. So there was some degree of restriction in how we tried to assess the whole circumstances of individuals that we supervised in the community. And that did mean that we had to mitigate and consider differently those risk profiles.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up now some specific programmes or some specific issues that arose or potentially arose through the pandemic. The first of those, I'd like to talk to you about the management of particular offenders. And Mrs. Smith, perhaps I could start with you. Were there any particular issues surrounding sex offenders?
No, not in general. So our main issues there was we have an accredited group work programme which is rolled out in most of the local authorities in Scotland, moving forward, making changes. So the ability to deliver a group work programme, because of the restrictions, came to an end, and no local authority attempted to do that safely until they could safely do it. So what you were able to do was you were able to adapt that group work programme into pieces of work that social workers could deliver on a one-to-one basis. Depending on the risk that an individual posed and their circumstances, some of the registered sex offenders that would have been jointly managed by Social Work and Police Scotland, measures were put in place in order to supervise them and to monitor them in the community. So we worked around the restrictions, and between ourselves, you know, certainly once PPE was being used and was understood, and there was a confidence around about the use of that, visiting people in their homes was able to resume. Justice service users are not just justice service users. They have a variety of other needs, and one of our concerns for all justice service users was multiple needs such as addictions and mental health. So there was and ensuring that those aspects of a person's life are intact forms part of our risk management plan. So people were disadvantaged by other services closing. So if you had someone who was attending, for instance, a psychological counselling, and that was no longer taking place, then we had to adapt our risk management plan to ensure that we were mindful of that deficit and ensure that we monitored a person's mental health on top of the other issues. So we pivoted to the situation, the evolving situation for people, but generally the management of our registered sex offenders, for some were prioritised, but I think that was an area across the country that we managed quite confidently and well.
Thank you. I'm going to jump forward a little bit in my notes. You've mentioned there group work,
yes,
and specifically the Making Changes programme. That's one of a number of programmes that are mentioned in the response, the Relate response. In terms of that group work, and you mentioned their risk assessment being taken, were any of those group work offerings, the one that's mentioned here is the Caledonian system? Are you familiar with that? Could you tell us what the Caledonian system is, first of all?
So the Caledonian system is a programme, an accredited programme that works with men who have been involved in intimate partner violence. It's described as a system because it not only works with the man who has committed the offence, but recognises the partners and children, if there's any children involved. So it works in a multidisciplinary way to work with the risk and work with the family, focusing on changing behaviour. It's a cognitive behavioural programme to work with the man to review his behaviour and put strategies in place to ensure that any future responses to stressful situations are not result in violence or coercive control. So it's a system response to domestic abuse.
Thank you. Were any changes made to the delivery of that programme, do you know, during the pandemic?
So, like moving forward, making changes, Caledonian couldn't take place face to face, but staff worked with people on an individual basis. The support to the women and to children was enhanced during that time. That might not have been on a face-to-face basis, but there was a recognition that we were speaking with police colleagues around about any concerns, any call-outs to homes, and we were making extra effort to ensure where we could do it safely, to make contact with victims or keep a line of communication open.
Were any parts of that programme delivered remotely, digitally?
Not that I know of, but I can't pull a memory of anybody discussing delivering that remotely. There is risks attached to delivering a programme with that content delivery remotely when you are not aware of who is within the household or where the individual is. So I wouldn't want to say categorically, but I don't think it was delivered remotely.
And you said a moment ago that the Making Changes programme was not delivered remotely for similar reasons. Would it be fair to say, therefore, that, again, paraphrasing, the elements of those programmes were delivered in a way that was most appropriate for them during the time? Is that a fair thing to say?
That would be correct.
Thank you. Mr. Lloyd, going back to the management of offenders, one of the other elements that I know from the Rule 8 response that social work get involved with is drug testing and treatment in terms of management. Were there any particular concerns or issues or impacts relating to that during the pandemic?
Do you know, if I'm honest, I'm struggling to remember the details of that. So, Lindsay, thank you.
So, so there was challenges around about testing, bringing people in, having them travel into the office to be there for nursing staff to test. So that was a challenge. So we had periods of time where we were ensuring people were given prescriptions, but we were unable to provide the tests which check for illicit drug use. So that posed us challenges. But again, as the lockdown progressed and there was an easing of lockdown, we were able to, with PPE, resume testing and ensure that we had the full drug treatment and testing order service in operation.
Thank you.
I think it was challenging engaging some of our service users subject to drug treatment and testing orders, and I remember probably April, May, after the first lockdown, we had a service user come into the office. At that point we were testing again, and really not appreciating the enormity of what was going on worldwide, globally. And I remember the staff reflecting with me afterwards that he had really no notion of what was going on in relation to lockdown. So again, this assumption that everybody was aware of the global pandemic, it was really struck home that for some who are really disenfranchised, that wasn't aware. So we had done a bit of a safety conversation with that individual about them keeping themselves, healthy and safe. But yes, it was just it was a challenging time for some of our really vulnerable service users.
In terms of your service users, you've mentioned there someone not being aware and not therefore perhaps understanding the full enormity. Did you have any service users that were in the opposite position in terms of concerns about engaging or coming in for testing or the like because of the pandemic at the time? Yes,
we did, and we applied a trauma-informed lens when we were dealing with situations like that and balancing out whether it was a genuine fear and how we could work around it, but also mindful that if it was an avoidance of supervision or monitoring, so that would have been a very delicate conversation that the allocated social worker would be having with management, and we would be making a decision on what was proportionate, what the full facts were for that individual, and where we could flex on those occasions.
Thank you. Mr. Traynor, could I ask you now about criminal justice and in particular parole arrangements? At the start of the pandemic, we've heard evidence last week now from members of the criminal bar and criminal solicitors about criminal courts closing and then reopening. So his lordship is fully familiar in terms of the background of that. Did those closures have any impact on social work involvement?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the big change was the move online, particularly to parole hearings. But our ability to undertake full risk assessment, so a key role in the social work function pre-release is to undertake a home circumstances study. So again, that was impacted because you couldn't do the type of assessment that you would normally do in terms of understanding the full environment that individuals who were applying for parole and release were returning to. So you had to think about that. You then had to think about how you were able to present your information to the parole board, and if there were no hearings at that particular time, how you made sure that the recommendation was considered fully by the parole board. And then ultimately we were in attendance at hearings online, and you know, I suppose one of the things that happened in the pandemic was that we did move meetings that were possible to be held virtually to be virtual meetings. Across the board, some people found that useful, some people didn't. You know, so the reaction was not universal. I had some individuals locally, in terms of parole hearings, who said they found them less stressful because they were able to participate from an environment that they were comfortable and safe in. Similarly, in the child protection world, we had some people saying that they felt better not being in a room full of professionals because they felt able to contribute. We had other people who said they felt that was an invasion into their home. So it was a very mixed reaction. There were some impact on the ability to get people out, but once people are released, individuals are released on parole, a key part of the social work function is to help them reintegrate to society. Society was very different at that particular point. So we had to think about how do they report. Many people coming out of prison would not have had, for example, mobile phones. The only way to claim benefits was through mobile phones. So there were a number of technical issues that we had to undertake as well. But again, I think that staff flexed, so staff would consider fully how they could best support someone being released from prison to be safe, to understand those restrictions that Mrs Smith mentioned, that they understand the full impact of that they were being released from incarceration where they didn't have freedom of movement to a situation in the community where they didn't have freedom of movement either. So the staff had to think creatively about how they would supervise, but also how they would support.
You've mentioned there changes in terms of how some of these parole hearings in particular were taking place. Have any of those changes been sustained?
Yes, so there are some parole hearings that take place in person, but actually a significant number of parole hearings continue to be held virtually. So I think that where technology has helped, we have embraced it, but it's not always possible. So we've also used technology. I think we mentioned it in our Rule 8 notice, a near me process whereby we are able to engage particularly with women who are incarcerated currently in the women's prison, and the technology helps them retain a relationship, although a distant relationship, with their supervising social worker or their family social worker. So we have moved, but there are aspects of social work which are best delivered in person. And Mrs Smith mentioned the group work programmes, where we were very clear that the supervision within the room of the group work is really important, and we would not deliver those online, but some meetings across the board have continued to be held virtually.
Thank you. Mr Lloyd, one of the consequences of less trials is less convictions, if I can put it that way. Convictions in court cases in terms of criminal cases is not the only potential disposal. There are obviously alternative disposals. In particular, Mr. Traynor has mentioned diversion from prosecution. In your experience, was there any impact on that or the use of diversion from prosecution during the pandemic?
Yes, it increased. No doubt influenced by the reduction in court business, the inability to process cases via the court. And in many ways that was a welcome increase. Social Work Scotland and local authorities have been working with Procurator Fiscal, police and courts to increase diversion from prosecution schemes for some time. So that was positive. But with a caveat that always would want to ensure that those referred are appropriately referred, and that it does apply to those that present a lower risk of reoffending than others, where statutory measures might well be required.
Given that ordinarily there'd be a structured intervention by social work upon an alternative disposal, was there any impact on that during the pandemic?
So again, I can't speak nationally, but certainly locally, we saw them in accordance with the public health restrictions, including on a face-to-face basis, where the 2 metre distancing rule and face masks applied.
Mrs. Smith, another alternative disposal, I suppose, is unpaid work. Was there any impacts upon that during the pandemic?
Yes, there was a significant impact on unpaid work. Unpaid work is often characterised by a squad-type placement where you have one supervisor to 5 people who are subject to unpaid work. So it's a group setting normally. Unpaid work also takes the form of voluntary work within community settings, within charity establishments, within community centres. So it had a significant impact on our ability to offer a group setting placement. It caused a lot of concern because we were very mindful that these are court orders, that we were very clear that we wanted to discharge our duties in order to meet the requirements of the court order, but equally to support the individual to get through hours because of the stress upon them of not being able to get through hours, but equally very mindful of victims and that repayment aspect to it. So it had... We were really challenged around about how we would respond to it, and we also we had raised the concerns that we were having with Scottish Government, and we did receive a letter from the Chief Medical Officer giving us permission to stand them down during really significant periods of lockdown. So court activity very much ground to a halt. So we had a situation where we had a total of outstanding hours in the system. We had a situation where we were not getting additional hours on because of the court business wasn't operating fully, but we were not able to get through the hours. So it was causing a degree of stress. There was innovation, but we were very clear that we did not want to move far from the integrity of what unpaid work is there to do. So we were able to innovate, and service users were offered some activity to do online. Some local authorities innovated around about delivering bird boxes that people within their home could put together in order to reduced their hours, but we were limited in really having a big impact. So as a result, we saw that there was an accumulation of outstanding hours. From a Social Work Scotland point of view, we were expressing those concerns with Scottish Government, and it did result in the regulations being laid and the decision to reduce the number of hours by 35%. So, and also the measures around about allowing any new orders to extend for a period of 12 months. So it was probably one of our most pressing issues throughout the pandemic, because even when we were able to start services again, it wasn't with the 1:5 ratio. It was often 1:2, and we were challenged with ongoing issues with journeying people to sites, with bans and the restrictions that precluded us from doing that. So it was challenging. When we came out of lockdown, we then had the challenges of the additional hours that we were given support, financial support, to increase our capacity and to increase, our staffing capacity to try and get through the hours that had amassed. So it was a very challenging area. I think we've only recently, I probably think, come out of that, and we are now probably at a business as usual position across the country.
Sorry,
Please,
I'll come to you in a moment, Mr. Farrugia. Just one brief follow-up. You mentioned there being mindful not only of the clients but also victims. It's a personal view, I appreciate, but Mrs. Smith, do you feel that the balance between those in terms of implementing that reduction in hours, for example, or allowing that extension of time, do you feel that balance was right in terms of the appreciations of both victims and indeed offenders?
I do think the balance was right. I think we spent a huge amount of time thinking through the challenges that unpaid work were presenting to us. We were very mindful of justice being able to run its course and how we would support it. And we were conscious that there is always a victim that we need to be considering. So yes, I think we looked at it holistically, and we spoke about it. We considered it a lot. We considered the individuals, we considered the staff, we just considered the community, and we considered the victims.
Thank you. Mr. Farrugia.
It was very much in that space, really. I just wanted to sort of underline what Ms. Smith was saying. I can remember those weeks, particularly around unpaid work and around the early release of prisoners, really complex things, which picks up on his lordship's observation about balance. And I suppose I commend them as examples of where it really felt all relevant parts of the system were coming, as Ms. Smith was saying, to really consider the necessary balance that needed to be done to ensure that our justice system could continue to stand, and our prison estate too. And they felt very purposeful, they felt very constructive, and they felt like really good examples of where the system, those who were responsible for both owning and delivering the system, really came together to consider that balance and make decisions that took all of those various components into account.
Thank you. The final thing I want to touch upon just in this section, I'm conscious that we are coming close to the end of our time, but there is a couple of things I just want to pick up with you. Mr. Traynor, one of the other areas where social work is involved is in terms of prisons. Were there any impacts in terms of that, in terms of access, or in terms of the work that was required to be carried out by social work in that environment?
Yes, I mean, I don't have a prison in my local area, and Mrs. Smith does, so she might be able to explain a bit more. But yes, social workers in the field could not access prisons. That was one fundamental difference. But the prison social work service had to flex as well. And whilst the restrictions were in place across Scotland about accessing workplaces, those restrictions impacted on our colleagues who operated in prisons in terms of being able to attend their workplace. Prisons, I'm sure his lordship and the inquiry understand, are very complex places where we have a whole host of needs, and the population in Scotland has become older and more frail in some of our prisons, and social care and social work are often required to support the prison officers deliver that service. But there's also that bit about looking at rights and challenging where there are discrimination. The prison social work teams were severely restricted in terms of access to the workplace and therefore the ability to support individuals in prison. But I don't know if Mrs Smith maybe wants to say a little bit more, because she actually has a prison in her area and operates some of that service.
Certainly.
So staff did work in the prison and remotely. One of the key issues that we needed to resolve really quickly with our SPS colleagues was around about remote access to what is called the PR2 system. So that's the main prison case management system that you could only access whilst in an establishment. We worked very closely with our SPS colleagues, and we enjoy a legacy relationship with them that really started then to resolve that, and for us to quickly roll out remote access to prison-based social work staff to be able to work from home as well as being in an establishment. So it was challenging, and social work staff very much were working in line with the guidance that was being given to SPS staff, and we very much aligned ourselves to those instructions given by the prison service and how we would conduct ourselves in and around the establishment. But we did minimise footfall. Again, we have small offices often within establishments, so we ensured that staff who were present were able to socially distance. In order for us to do that, we did it in a hybrid way, and were able to manage that with having access to the systems externally.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we only have 5 minutes left. I'm going to come to each of you very briefly in a moment, just to see if there's anything you specifically want to highlight to His Lordship, if there are any matters that we haven't managed to cover. Before I do that, Ms Lloyd, could I just ask you one question regarding the impact on social work staff specifically? The Rule 8 response mentions the difficulties that staff had, in particular the blurring of work and home life, the lack of respite, the stress and the lack of colleagues and the like. I wonder if you might be able to give His Lordship a bit of a feel about that.
Yeah, and social work teams have to work, even in normal circumstances, let alone a pandemic, in very complex, challenging, changeable circumstances. They're having to risk assess and support some of the most vulnerable people in society, and make huge decisions that relate to not just how we support them, but potentially how we restrict their liberty as well. Those kinds of decisions often require consultation with colleagues, support from managers, and they're often emotive as well. They can be quite upsetting for staff who develop close relationships with the people they support. So imagine then the impact of the pandemic. More of them are working from home. They have less opportunity to speak and ventilate even with their colleagues, or obtain advice from their manager. They're working differently. They're not necessarily able to see their service users on a face-to-face basis. They're seeing some of them via telephone or video link. All of that was incredibly challenging, and then add to that the changeability of the pandemic in terms of different policy, different guidelines, different advice as it unfolded. So a huge amount of stress, not just for frontline social workers and support workers, but also for the managers that support them and the managers that support the managers. And so it required ongoing, regular visibility, communication, support, reassurance, and some of that still applies actually, because the home working scenario, the hybrid working models, new challenges that have emerged after the pandemic in relation to cost of living crisis, etc., all make the role challenging, and managers are continuing to adapt to that, and we're still learning about some of that, I think.
Thank you. We have a very short period of time, but if you do have some brief points, Mr. Traynor, if I could start with you.
Yes, I think when I reflect back on the pandemic, I think that we responded as well as we could. I think that the social work profession came forward, and our care colleagues, our social care colleagues came forward. They placed themselves at risk, and just a slight addition to what Mr. Lloyd said there. Actually, social work is often working with the society's distressed and most distressed and troubled families or children or individuals, and the importance of the supervision that we give to our staff is really important. But your home is normally your safe place, and suddenly our staff were taken to their houses, the distress, because they were experiencing that distress, and I don't think we can underestimate that. So for me, the big thing in justice, we tried to deliver a support service that discharged our court functions, our duties in terms of supervision, still based around sensitivity and trauma to support the most vulnerable. But it had a major impact. I think we're now seeing the recruitment crisis. We mentioned that in our Rule 8. Social work has seen a number of people leave the profession early. We are seeing not as many people coming forward to undertake the social work training, and we need a comprehensive plan to look at workforce development and recruitment so that social work can deliver the justice function as well as we were before, but better. And I do think there is a capacity issue there, but with a good support across the 32 local authorities, with our academic partners and with the Scottish Government, we can rebuild that workforce to help make Scotland a safer place.
Thank you. Mrs. Smith?
So one of my reflections of where we're at now is we had to work as a justice system together to respond to this, and I think the introduction across the board of Teams, of the other platforms that we started to WebEx from really assisted us in coming together as a justice system to tackle the issues that the pandemic we're facing, that we're throwing at us. But to probably end on a really positive note, I think we're benefiting from those relationships that were started then. So we have developed diversion, we've developed home detention curfews, we've developed the bail offering into court as a result of being able to meet nationally virtually with our key justice partners. And the pandemic for me started those conversations, built those relationships, and I think we are in a better place. So for a positive going forward, I think that's something, that's a strength that has come out of the pandemic for us, that we have these national meetings, relationships, and forums in which to develop policy, practice, and bring ourselves together to be better placed to deal with any adversity in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Lloyd?
I think two things, and you mentioned earlier on the importance of a holistic response to a public health crisis, and I think arguably as a profession, a regulated profession which routinely carries out risk assessments within a human rights context and makes decisions on both care and control or support and restrictive measures, that social work was, if not well placed to lead, then at least well placed to make a huge contribution to the initial national response. And I think there's something there about the visibility of and understanding of the profession that needs to be further elevated. I think we would argue.
Thank you. And Mr. Ferrugia?
Agree with all my colleagues, and try and end on a positive as well, that I think I appreciate it's difficult proving an absence or or the prevention of something, but unfortunately that is the space that social work largely operates in. It's about trying to stop things happening, largely, of course, make things happen, but in the protective space that we were pushed into, I think, in the pandemic context. And I think the limited number, the fact that we aren't able really to identify lots of examples of where things went wrong is actually profoundly evidence of social work success, of social workers continuing to turn up and deliver the service discreetly, unseen, unshouted about, uncelebrated largely, and I think fulfilling those local authority responsibilities. And I think with the privileged position I had throughout there, seeing across the country, I think we have right to be very proud of the situation that we were able to maintain and to protect across our individuals and communities in Scotland.
Thank you. My Lord, I have no further questions unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you, Mr. Turner. Thank you all very much for your evidence. I'm very grateful. 11:45.
All rise.
now. Good morning again, Mr. Stephen.
Good morning, my lord.
I understand we're remote now.
We do. So the next witness giving evidence today remotely is Anne Lafferty, representing the Advocacy Project.
Very good. Good morning, Miss or Mrs. Lafferty. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, my lord.
Very good. Mr. Stephen's going to ask you some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. First again, I'll ask the same question. Can you hear me all right, Miss Lafferty, before we begin?
Yeah, I'll let you know if I can. I do wear hearing aids, so I'll just because it's online, I'll ask if I can't hear, sorry.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Could I start, please, just by asking you to confirm your full name?
It's Anne Frances Lafferty.
Thank you. You've already provided a written statement to the inquiry, signed and dated the 14th of January 2025, and for the inquiry's record, the reference for that statement is SCI-WT0385-5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate at the outset that everything you said in that statement will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on every single aspect of it in your oral evidence today. And just a gentle reminder that the hearing is being transcribed, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly. Thank you. So you're here today to give evidence on behalf of the Advocacy Project. Could I start by asking you, please, when that organisation was first established?
1992.
Thank you. And why was that organisation created?
Well, it started as a grassroots organisation where disabled people got together to try and support each other to be able to speak up about the services they were getting. That was the original idea, and then it's developed from there, and it's now something that's funded for different reasons, yeah.
And what would you say are the key aims or principles of the Advocacy Project?
We support people to be involved in decisions about their lives, issues that are happening, maybe accessing health and social care.
And I think you describe it in your statement as an independent advocacy service, is that correct?
Yeah, we're independent in the sense that we don't work for social work or healthcare, so we're able to challenge things without worrying about impacting and having any conflict of interest.
And the basis of your services is both free and confidential, is that right?
Yes.
You also say in your statement, I think, that the organisation operates as a third-party reporting centre for hate crime. What does that entail?
It means that anybody who perceives themselves to be a victim of hate crime can come to us and we can support them to make a report to the police, either anonymously or with as much detail as they want, and then support them with aspects of that going forward, so that the hate crime is recorded and dealt with appropriately.
Thank you. And could I ask you just to explain who your typical service users are, whether that's the age range or the range of people that you deal with?
We deal with anybody 16 plus who identifies as having a disability or a mental health issue. They don't need a formal diagnosis of a mental health issue to help get our support. So everybody from people with depression, mental health issues, a whole range, learning disability, brain injury, older people, dementia, right across the board, basically.
And ordinarily, outside the pandemic, how would people go about accessing your services?
So you can either be referred by somebody, so that's a lot of the time that's mental health officers, social workers, anybody in any kind of health and social care field, or perhaps family members, and you can also self-refer. So you could either do that online, by telephone, or actually just dropping in.
Thank you. And in a given year, typically how many service users would you be working with?
I should have got the exact stats, but roughly about 3,000 people.
And in what area of Scotland would those service users be drawn from?
We work in Glasgow and East Renfrewshire.
Thank you. And are there examples you can give to the inquiry of perhaps recurring or common issues that you would be asked to assist with in terms of advocacy support?
Yeah, approximately 70%, I think, of our work is supporting people who have been detained in hospital, perhaps Mental Health Act. So a lot of it's legislative work supporting them through the process of being detained and getting back into the community or getting the correct treatment and supporting them through that process. So that's a big aspect of our work. Also adult support and protection and guardianship, and then a lot of other self-directed support is another sort of legislative piece of work we do, and then other issues as well.
Thank you. And we'll come back to guardianship and operation of the mental health tribunals later on in your evidence. In terms of the funding position for your organisation, how does that typically work?
Mainly, advocacy is a tender process where a local authority would put a tender out and you would apply with other people and hopefully be successful and win the bid. That's usually for 3 years with an option to extend for 1 or 2. And we also have some other funding which comes from the Scottish Government for self-directed support and other wee pockets sometimes of funding that you can get to support people.
And you mentioned that tender process. I think you say in your statement at paragraph 12 it's a statutory requirement, isn't it, in legislation that local authorities have to have an advocacy service. Is that right?
Under the Mental Health Act, yes, it's mentioned specifically. In other legislation, it's best practice that an advocacy worker is involved, support the person to be as involved as possible in the processes. Thank you. In terms of your current role at the Advocacy Project, what is that and how long have you held it for? I'm currently the Business Director, and that post began in December, successful in that post, December 2024. And what was your role at the project during the pandemic? I was an operations manager. And what would that have entailed in terms of your responsibilities? So I was actually directly line managing the advocacy workers who would normally be out in the field. So there was 5 operations managers at that point. I managed the business support team and 5 advocacy workers. And what was the size of your, or is the size of your organisation as a whole? It was approximately in the region of about 40 during the pandemic. And of that number, how many would be advocacy workers? Majority, I think there was about 24, 25 approximately. Thank you. Before we move to the pandemic, could you also just describe to the inquiry the typical ways in which you would work outside the pandemic, locations of where you would deliver the advocacy services, please? Yeah, so primarily our service is delivered where the individual lives, so that would be your own home, or if you were in hospital on the wards, in a care home, any other kind of place that somebody lived, sheltered accommodation, hostels, prison. So we go to the people basically. They don't normally come to us. Rare circumstances, maybe if somebody was homeless and they didn't have somewhere to meet, we would invite them into our offices. So that was an option too. And is that face-to-face service, and I think as you say it, going out to the community, is that important for advocacy? Yes. Could I ask you why? Sorry, what was that? Could I ask you why? Why is that important? Because it helps the person feel more secure and able, and a lot of the people we work with have different conditions. They may be housebound or early onset dementia or in a care home or a hospital, maybe detained in hospital so they can't actually leave the hospital for various reasons. So it's really important we go to them, and then they're in their home turf, and it helps them, I suppose, relax a bit, and then we can explain what our role is, and if they want to engage with that, then we can support them to meet the outcomes that they're hoping to get. Thank you. If we move then to the pandemic and the impact on your organisation, now you say
I think at paragraph 17 of your statement, and consistent with what you've just said, that you were completely office-based, I think, prior to the pandemic, and I don't think you said you had any home working in place. Could I ask you just to describe the immediate steps that you had to take as an organisation to tailor your advocacy services when lockdown was imposed, please?
Yeah, so we had to move everything online, and we didn't have the structure in place for that at that point, so it was about enabling the staff to get laptops. So we had to buy laptops basically for everybody, move everybody into their homes, obviously working from their bedrooms, a kitchen or spare room office if they have something like that, and then move to a telephone-based system until we got laptops, where then we were able to use Zoom and various online platforms to start trying to engage with people who had those facilities at home and could actually use them too, because that was a barrier for a lot of people.
And I think, again, you say in your statement at paragraph 17 that I think one of the reasons you're office-based is because of the difficult issues that your staff have to deal with. What was the impact, whether in terms of anxiety, mental health, or indeed otherwise, on your staff having to deal with the same issues, but having to do so perhaps at home rather than an office environment?
So obviously they were dealing with the pandemic as well and getting their heads around that, and also their own health conditions and family members too, and then the impact of supporting a lot of the service users who were understandably worried about everything too. So it all kind of blew up, if you like. It was just very, very difficult initially till people could understand what we could do to help people. They were worried about a lot of the people they supported because they were very vulnerable, and they would have fallen into what became like shielding and things like that. So, and a lot of people we support have communication difficulties, so even trying to engage with them on the telephone could be difficult. Not being able to deliver the service that we want to, the quality we wanted to, because of the way we had to deliver the service.
Thank you. And how could service users contact your organisation during lockdown in particular?
So our telephone service remained in place the whole time, so the number didn't change, so that was fine, and all staff had mobile phones too. So usually we don't give out our work mobile numbers, because sometimes you have people who would call you all the time, all day, if they were anxious about things. But we changed that during the pandemic. Staff gave out their numbers, their work numbers, not their personal numbers. And then as we got laptops for everybody, we were able to then engage as a team online using Microsoft Teams, and then other places started being able to engage online, so you were able to use whatever platforms, usually Zoom or Microsoft Teams.
Again, at the beginning, at lockdown, was it the case that contact would have stopped at all with any of your service users?
For some people, yeah, they didn't have computers or telephones, so that would have stopped completely. So it was very difficult. Obviously, you couldn't go out and post letters and things either, so it was all just very difficult trying to establish contact. Yes, and a lot of people live on their own, so they didn't have the same support network going in, because people couldn't visit and different things. So just for some people, yeah, it was difficult.
And did all of your service users necessarily understand what was happening or why the means of contact was changing?
No, that was difficult for a lot of people. As I said, we work with a lot of people who maybe have a learning disability or have a brain injury or mental health issues or dementia. So trying to explain why we weren't able to come when the expecting you and different things was difficult, and also to explain how things, because they were asking us questions about what's going to happen with my carer who normally comes and different things, and it's a lot of things that we couldn't answer because we didn't have all the answers for them for every single thing, and trying to get those answers was a more long-winded process with all the people you're having to phone to then get back, and then they'd maybe not understand they'd asked you certain questions and things, so it was really, really difficult for some people, yeah.
And did those drawbacks or limitations apply then to telephone advocacy? I think you mentioned that earlier in your evidence just now, and you also mentioned it in your statement. I mean, were there any limits to what you could do in terms of advocacy when only the telephone was available?
Yeah, normally we support people in a variety of different ways to engage. So obviously people with a hearing impairment or deaf or use certain communication tools or different things like that, or didn't have English as a first language. So all these kind of things are very difficult using the telephone, and some of them you can get aspects of it remotely when you move to online, but it's just another barrier.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier in your evidence the referral process normally for people reaching your organisation. In your statement, I think you say during the pandemic you missed out on indirect routes to supporting people during COVID. Could you explain, please, what you mean by those indirect routes?
Yeah. So an example may be we are often in all the mental health wards supporting people, and there's posters and different things up explaining the service. So somebody may come up and say, oh, you're the advocacy worker, can I speak to you a wee minute, and different things like that, and you'd be able to take a referral for somebody. Or, for example, if you were in a care home and somebody asked you something, a question about something, even a family member, you would be able to explain what we were able to do to support, and then again another referral could be taken. So that kind of thing about being out in the community and actually engaging with the people in the communities that we can support in, that was lost because we weren't able to be out in the communities.
Thank you. For those who could access your service during that time via telephone or otherwise, and I'm thinking specifically, I suppose, of those who might have been in hospital wards or care homes, did they always have a private or confidential space in which they could speak to you about the issues that you support them with?
No, that was quite difficult. Again, some people maybe needed support to use the telephone or a computer or a tablet, or there wasn't a phone or a tablet where they were. So sometimes staff were supporting people and letting them have their phone and different things. So yeah, maybe we weren't always in a private, confidential space to engage, and maybe didn't always have the support because obviously the staff and hospitals and everything were just so busy and snowed under too because of everything that was going on.
And I think you mentioned at paragraph 74 of your statement, I think you talk about people perhaps being worried about a danger of repercussions if they were to perhaps express a view about what was happening in the place where they were located.
Yeah, so sometimes people have issues with the care and treatment they're receiving in a ward, in a care home, and having that confidential, safe space with your advocacy worker, you're able to say what's going on, and then we can obviously relay that appropriately wherever it has to go after that to try and resolve the issues, if it's a simple issue, or report it under adult support and protection or whatever the process may be. So if you were wanting to say, for example, a certain nurse was treating you unfairly, or you weren't happy with something that they were doing and they were in the room, then you weren't able to say that, or if you did, then you would be worrying about what would happen after it.
Thank you. And during the pandemic, did you notice any discernible increase in demand, either for your usual advocacy services or being asked for things perhaps that you felt fell out with your remit?
Yeah, the calls went up massively because people were calling us when they'd had support in the past, maybe, or they were on. Currently, we were supporting them about everything going on with their care. So normally we're issue-based and we can only deal with certain aspects of the issues in people's lives. But for people contacting us saying maybe my carers haven't been, I've got no food, or I don't know how to get my medication and different things. So we were trying to support with things like that we normally didn't, to just try and help people in any way we could while we were only being able to work from home. So yeah, so we kind of expanded what we were doing and started to compile a list of local things that we could find out that we could tap into to get people the help they needed.
So I think you say in your statement, I think in paragraph 26, you talk about some other agencies not being available, and that was why some of your service users were getting in touch with you. Which agencies are you speaking about there?
Quite a lot of them were grassroots agencies or maybe voluntary services and different things, like obviously befriending's a big thing for a lot of people, and obviously that stopped completely. Things like there's certain services that will go into people's homes who have dementia and different things and make sure they've got food and different things. So a lot of these kind of grassroots organisations just weren't able to operate at all. They didn't maybe have the funding or the structure, and these are really important support networks for a lot of people that rely on them, as well as the formal support they get, maybe from a carer or somebody going in too as well.
And being faced with these additional queries, was there an impact upon your staff that you can describe of having to deal with these extra calls that you've said?
We were dealing with a lot of really, really distressed people. There was an increase in the number of people calling us with deterioration in their mental health, impacting them and their families, and they were, I suppose, using the advocacy workers to talk about all of that. So it was just massive for people. And then there was also an increase in the level of people calling us who were suicidal. So staff have to deal with all of that, and that's why we're office-based, because we have that support network there to support staff when they've had a difficult call or a difficult meeting, to come back and have a safe space to debrief so that they're not impacted and their mental health and well-being isn't impacted with dealing with a lot of difficult things like that on a daily basis.
Thank you. You talk about, in paragraph 21 of your statement, about being denied access to people that you were supporting, I think specifically in relation to lockdown, when care homes and hospitals were locked down. Are there any particular groups or cohorts of your service users you think that were affected by that in particular, when you couldn't access them?
Well, everybody really, but it was very difficult. We're funded by NHS and local authorities. Other services were maybe allowed in to hospitals, and we felt we should have been able to get in. We were eventually, but it meant that a lot of people who were too unwell to engage over the telephone weren't able to get the support that we would normally give them when they were maybe detained in hospital or in a care home. A lot of the work that we do when people are deemed to lack capacity is in a safeguarding role to make sure that the processes are followed correctly. So you weren't able to be there to be part of that safeguarding role.
I think one example you give in that paragraph 21 is, I think, older people with no family as perhaps being affected by not having access to your advocacy services.
Yeah, so if perhaps somebody doesn't have a family member looking out for them, or a power of attorney or a guardian, that's very much non-instructed advocacy, where we ensure the person's past and present wishes are as much taken into consideration as possible when deciding care and treatment, and also that safeguarding element that I mentioned as well, so that things are done with the person in mind and not to the person.
Leads me on then to also key worker status. You say at paragraph 61 of your statement that that's not a status that I think your staff were given. Do you consider that they should have been and that would have been helpful to you?
We feel we should have been given that status, given how much we're involved in all those processes for people and the support that we provide, and the feedback we get from everybody is that it's so valuable. We know that. So yeah, that would have been so helpful in a lot of situations, so that we could have continued to deliver a better quality of service in the period that there was lockdowns and different things.
Because in that same paragraph you go on to say, I think, that it was a cause of frustration for staff and that morale dipped. Is that correct as a result of not having that status?
Yeah, people are just finding it. The reason a lot of us are in the job is that we want to give something back, and we are a charity, so that's the big reason you do the job, is the change and the support and the help that you give people. So you weren't able to really do your job as well as you could have, and I think that really made staff frustrated. And as a result, I think of that, during the latter stage of the pandemic, we lost about 13 or 14 of that team. So nearly half the staff team left either during that because it was impacting their mental health doing this job, and they couldn't do that anymore. They felt they couldn't, or they felt that that was enough, and they decided to take a change in career after the pandemic.
And in terms of vaccinations then and PPE, I think you say in your statement that with PPE you were providing your own, is that correct?
Yeah, we were lucky in that some local charities provided us with hand sanitizer. So we had big bottles of that we were able to distribute to staff and things. Because we're a charity, we didn't have a budget for a pandemic as such. Obviously, this was completely new to us. Obviously, you're planning for things like this now, but so we had to just take money from the budget. But you were saving money in travel, obviously, because you weren't out and about. So we purchased, we ordered and then eventually got our own PPE for staff.
And even without key worker status, I noted in your statement that you said that at least some hospitals in which you operated would still permit you access when restrictions eased. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. If I can move on then to the operation of the mental health tribunals, which you cover in your statement. If I could start firstly, before we get to the pandemic, just if you could outline or explain how the Advocacy Project would normally support somebody in that situation, then we'll come on to discuss how it was operating during the pandemic.
Yeah, so there's various ways. So somebody may be detained in hospital for the first time under the Mental Health Act, and we would go out and explain the role of advocacy and ask them if they wanted us to help support them while they're in hospital, and afterwards if they want that support and need it too. So a lot of the time for that, initially people may be only detained for a couple of days and they may get home if they're well enough. If not, then they go on to what's called a short-term detention, and that means you're held for a period of up to 28, 30 days, and they have to have a tribunal at the end of that with medical professionals and the person there and the advocacy worker usually, and they discuss the future care and treatment, about whether the person can go back home with different treatment and support, or they might need to then stay in hospital for more treatment, and that moves to a compulsory treatment order. So we're involved in making sure that people that are detained in hospital know all their rights, know what their treatment plan is, and if they're happy with that, perhaps they might want a lawyer to support them, so we would be able to support them to get a lawyer who then supports at their tribunal. Also, they might want to have a named person, which is somebody that they trust and maybe a family member or something, so we can help them to go through that process. And sometimes they write a statement about how they want to be treated in future should they be detained again. So they're the kind of things that we help. A lot of it's about supporting people to know what's going on and then supporting them to be involved as much as possible in everything that happens, meetings and different things about their care and support.
And when it came to mental health tribunal hearings prior to the pandemic, would it have been the case that you would have sat physically alongside the person concerned when that hearing was taking place?
Yes, that's a normal thing. We meet the person on the ward. All the meetings are face-to-face. And, well, this is before pandemic. Everything is face-to-face. That's why we spend a lot of time in the hospital, and you get known, really. So the advocacy workers are known to the staff and different things. So it means, you know, if it's a minor wee thing, we know the staff and everything. You can sometimes sort out minor issues there and then, and it stops things blowing up into major things. So, yeah, and you would sit at the tribunal supporting the person, because before it, you've spoke to them about what they want to say, maybe help them think about that. If the person gets distressed, the advocacy worker can say, you know, I can go out and support them. We can have wee breaks and different things so that everybody gets the best out of the process.
Thank you. Now, initially, when lockdown occurred, I think you say in your statement at paragraph 37 that those tribunals stopped operating altogether.
Yeah, initially, yeah.
And what would have been the consequence then for your service users during that period when the tribunals were not operating?
So we weren't able to support people at all when they were detained and ensure they knew their rights. Obviously support them to get lawyers and different things. So that stopped for a period till we were able to get contact with them. A lot of people maybe didn't have access to a mobile phone. So until that was able to be established, then we weren't able to really engage. So, yeah.
And you mentioned time limits earlier. Did that mean in practice that individuals were remaining in hospital for longer than would have been the case previously?
I don't know that for definite. There is legislation in place, so really people shouldn't be detained after the time. So I think there was just a push to try and get tribunals up and running in some fashion because you have deadlines to meet. The people that were on short-term detentions need to have the tribunal to keep them in hospital if it's going to a compulsory treatment order. But obviously there's planning for some people to get back home, so you can see how it could all start backing up.
Thank you. You then go on to say in your statement that those tribunals would resume and resumed remotely. Am I correct in saying that they resumed with telephone hearings? Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you've helpfully explained already how advocacy support would work prior to the pandemic. Can you highlight how the operation of these telephone hearings perhaps changed your role?
Yeah, so we would engage with the person before the tribunal. Normally would be face-to-face, trying to have those conversations over the telephone, which could be difficult depending on how well somebody is to engage, and trying to establish what they wanted to say at the tribunal. And then a date is made for the tribunal, and all the individuals had to dial into a telephone call that everybody was on. So obviously it's very difficult to gauge and support and see that the person was okay and not getting upset and different things, because you can't see any of that. So it just really made it quite difficult to give the quality of support we normally like to do. And then obviously it would go round the tribunal and different people would say what they had to say. And then normally the person would say different things, but you're not there to prompt, and sometimes people just wouldn't really engage. So it's just very, very difficult. It impacted on the whole thing, yeah.
Yes, and I mean that's consistent with what you say in your statement about it being very difficult when you couldn't physically be with them. You then go on to say later on, I think you could support them and even support them to dial into these calls. Can I ask you if there were ever any examples when you weren't able to physically join them, where those individuals were not able to join those calls for the hearings themselves?
Well, sometimes people choose not to go to the hearing anyway. So I suppose there was a bit of an increase in that because people couldn't really engage without support. When we moved online, because we had laptops, when we were allowed back into the wards, we were able to sit with the person and dial into the meeting side by side with the person. So that became a bit better then, because you're able to then gauge if the person needed a break, if they were getting upset, different things.
And in your experience, what was the quality of the connection, audio or video, if they were based in a hospital ward, for example?
There could be difficulties with that as well, because you have to rely on Wi-Fi. So then we started getting staff to dial into a hot hub or something on your phone? I can't remember the right title, sorry. So we were just always trying to come up with solutions to the problems that we're facing, is to try and give the people the best support we could, really.
And were telephone hearings suitable for all of your service users in the mental health sphere? For example, I think you mentioned at paragraph 66 of your statement those with schizophrenia.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what's going on for the individual and how well they are and what stage they are in their journey, a lot of people, it's not the best way for them to engage and be able to represent themselves in the best way where they are with their mental health and what kind of help and support they were looking for.
And in terms of access to devices, you touched on this earlier on, but were there any particular steps that you as an organisation took to mitigate, perhaps, if they didn't have a device? Were you able to do anything in respect of that?
So our staff all had laptops. We got all staff laptops, so they were able to use them, because obviously it'd be preferable if the person had their own, but a lot of people didn't have that equipment, or a mobile phone in some instances. So, you know, we were able to tap into some other charities and different things who were supporting digital exclusion and get some people equipment as well. And in some wards, staff maybe brought in tablets and things that were lying at home. So there was actually like then a ward tablet or something like that, a device that people could share. So, I mean, as the pandemic wore on, these different solutions were being put in place by staff and ourselves and different people, anything we could do to try and help people to be able to communicate.
And before I move on, in terms of the telephone hearings operation themselves, I think you speak in your statement, I think at paragraph 73, for example, of some frustration amongst advocacy workers. Did you feel that you were able to effectively do your advocacy role at these telephone hearings?
I think there's just so much to get through when it's done on a telephone basis rather than face-to-face, that a lot of the times perhaps an advocacy worker would dial into the tribunal and be sat there for a couple of hours during the tribunal while everything was relayed, and then they wouldn't be asked if there was anything they wanted to add at the end. We're there to support the person to speak up, but if the person may be engaged in whatever fashion, then they would take that as that, and maybe there's bits that they hadn't put across that they had wanted to, but quite often we were, I suppose, missed out a wee bit at that time. But I can, you understand everything took much longer than normal because of the way it was being relayed around telephones.
So I think in some instances, certainly in your statement, you say that this sometimes felt like a complete waste of a worker's time. I think you mean their advocacy workers. Is that right?
Yeah. That's what they felt, because they were sitting there for a couple of hours when they could have been using those hours to support somebody else better than sitting listening to everybody. I know that sounds bad, but they were just getting frustrated that they were sitting there and then not being asked to contribute, and maybe they know that the person had more to say, but weren't able to convey that over the telephone.
Thank you. I want to move on now to guardianship, something which you dedicate a bit of your statement to. And two particular things you mention, I think, are the stop the clock guardianship provisions, and then also the use of a statutory power, Section 13ZA of the Social Work Scotland Act 1968. Now, we'll come to both of those in a second, but just before that, could I ask you to explain just briefly, for those who might not understand, in the circumstances in which the Advocacy Project would be involved in supporting those, either seeking or renewing guardianship orders, what your role would be normally prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of people who are deemed to lack capacity. So a lot of that maybe potentially, if there was no powers of attorney in place, it would have to go through guardianship process, which can be quite lengthy. And our role is to support the person that the guardian application is being made for. So, the person who lacks capacity. And again, as I mentioned earlier, depending on where they are, if used in dementia, for an example, if it was early dementia, you'd be able to engage with the person and get a view on what they would like their future to look like, what their life has been like, what their past and present wishes are, and be able to convey that as the process moves on, to make sure people are taking that into account, because that's the best practice in the Act. It should be that is taken into account. So we're supporting the person to be involved as much as possible. If somebody's in a more advanced state of dementia, then it's very much the safeguarding role to make sure that the process is done correctly and that their views and wishes were known by speaking to relevant involved others, may that be family members or carers and different things, so that the person's past views and wishes can be put forward and taken into account when they're making decisions about which powers would be best to support that person.
Thank you. And you mentioned the guardianship process. Would that ordinarily involve a court in that process?
Yeah, so we are very much involved prior to that. So we would be visiting the person, meeting all the relevant people we needed to, and then we usually put a statement in, and that's usually considered by the judge when making the decision about the guardianship order, so that the person's views are represented in that decision.
And you mentioned the length of time it would ordinarily take for one of those orders to be granted. Did you notice a difference during the pandemic in terms of the processing of those applications for guardianship orders?
Yeah, well, that's where the stop the clock came in, because they brought in stop the clock, which meant that if you were already under guardianship, the clock stopped and that guardianship order continued until they were at a point where they were able to then start guardianships again. So in effect, if you were able to maybe not be under guardianship, if it was a different condition, you may be under guardianship longer than you would have been normally. But it just meant that people, whatever stage in their journey, stopped because it couldn't go forward until they were able to restart the process again. So that's the stop the clock. It really is what it means. It's just everything just stopped.
And at paragraph 71 of your statement, I think you say that one of the biggest impacts on your service was the stop the clock process. Can I ask you to just elaborate on why that was the case, to the extent you haven't already?
Yeah, so I suppose it was one of the things that impacted on was people that you were maybe supporting who were in hospital, maybe gone into hospital for one reason, and then they had discovered that the person maybe had dementia or something like that. So normally the process would be they're in hospital for a period and then they would maybe be moved, if they were in agreement, to a care home or back home with support and different things. But obviously a lot of people remained in hospital or were unfortunate and had COVID as well and different things. So it just really impacted in that whole thing. So people were basically stuck, for want of a better word, because they were in limbo in hospital. And then for some people, when beds were needed, they were moved out into care homes.
Thank you. You also mentioned Section 13ZA of the 1968 Act. Just in general terms, before we come to how that was operating during the pandemic, what does that power normally enable to happen?
Yeah, it's not used very frequently anymore, but it's when there's no guardian or powers in place, and the person, as an example would be they're in hospital and they're saying, we don't think it's safe for you to go home, we think you should maybe potentially go into care and we can do an assessment better of your needs and see what you need. And if the person's able to agree and they've got no reason, they're just like, yeah, I'm fine, I'm in agreement with that, they can use 13ZA to move them on to the place and then get the assessments and everything done then. But it's very much the person has to be able to say, yeah, I've got no issues with that. So it doesn't get used a lot.
And did the use of that power change during the pandemic? And if so, how, in your experience, did it change?
So it got used a bit more because people were getting moved into care homes from hospital during the pandemic, but there was no powers in place for a lot of people. So I think that was the legislation they could use to move the people from from hospital, into care homes, because most people weren't getting sent back home because they didn't have the support. I guess they couldn't get the care packages and everything put in place like you would normally have a process where all that planning would take place in hospital before the person went home.
And why was that of concern to you specifically as an advocacy service at that time?
It's used very rarely because it's very difficult if somebody does lack capacity and they're unwell and different things to be sure that they're really saying, yeah, I'm happy with that. Quite often when people get moved in our experience with that, they're then saying, oh, but I didn't want to come here. This isn't, a lot of people maybe just say, yeah, whatever, and just agree without, if they've not got the support to think about it, and if they don't have family and different things who know what best their needs are, it's quite a tricky one.
And did you as an organisation make those concerns known to anybody else?
We're still having regular meetings with our commissioners, so that's the kind of things that we bring up when we're speaking to them, and then they can go and, speak to the relevant people about whatever the issue is we're raising with the commissioners. But it was very tricky because we know everything that was going on. It was just a very difficult time Yeah.
And to be clear, the inquiries heard evidence that there were emergency provisions made in relation to that Section 30ZA power, but they were never brought into force. So are the concerns that you're raising in relation to the power as it was being exercised too frequently, or what? How would you distill the concern you had?
I suppose there was a bit of an increase, but I think it was more, I suppose people were getting moved from hospital to care homes when there was no powers in place, basically. That's the concern, really. We understand why people had to get moved, but it did result in people maybe being placed in care who would have normally gone home and had a care package, or people then deteriorating once they'd gone into care and different things. So I suppose the impact on individuals we support was greater.
And when you say no powers were in place, just to be clear, what do you mean by that?
I mean, no guardianship, no power of attorney.
Okay, thank you. The final thing I wanted to touch on with you this morning was just in relation to prisoners. Paragraph 68 of your statement, I think you refer to HMP Barlinnie in particular, and of referrals being made, I think, to your organisation pre-pandemic. Did those referrals continue during the pandemic, and if not, what would you highlight to the inquiry as any consequences for those prisoners?
Yeah, it was very, very difficult for prisoners to receive a service from us during the pandemic, because that has to be delivered face-to-face for lots of different reasons, and obviously prisoners only have a few calls and different things. It was difficult for them to then use a telephone advocacy service, basically, so most of our prison work kind of just dried up, I suppose, and stopped because we weren't able to engage with them in the way that we really should have been able to.
And do you think that had any adverse impact on those prisoners not being able to access your services?
Yeah, well, we support prisoners mainly with access to health and social care. So it might be planning for release, or it may be treatment they're receiving for mental health or different things whilst in prison. So obviously that has an impact if they've got no other support there to try and get whatever it is they're looking for help with.
I think you refer, for example, to whether it's access to medication or being able to see a doctor. That's something that your services may have assisted with pre-pandemic, at least.
Yeah. So a lot of it really is about medical and health for prisoners that we support with. So that obviously is difficult when they didn't have that as another way of getting access to what they needed, what they felt they needed.
Thank you. I don't really have any further questions to ask you, so it was really just an opportunity, if there's any particular issues that we haven't covered or that you wish to emphasise, or indeed any lessons learned, you think, in terms of the Scottish Government's pandemic response that you would like to highlight to this inquiry, then I'd be grateful if you could do so now. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose we've all learned so much, but we're now able to mobilise should anything similar happen, because we now work both hybrid, so an element of hybrid working now, and we've learned lots of different skills and techniques. But I think the main thing for us would be to be considered as key workers should anything like this happen again, because the support we provide is very much, when it happens properly, is early intervention and stops things escalating further to more serious consequences. So being able to still have been able to deliver the service at the quality we like to would have hugely benefited a lot of people, I think. Should anything as awful happen again.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for the witness.
Thank you very much. Ms Stephen, and thank you, Ms Lafferty. I'm very grateful for your evidence. That's all. Thank you. 1:45 2
Yes.
this afternoon.
All
Thank you.
right.